excited about very briefly presenting the third chapter out of 4 in our research on judicial management. And this is actually the part where admin law on the one hand and political science and public policy on the other hand converge in terms of our conceptual understanding. And what we mean by that is that we, and Shimon Shitrit also referred to this part of our research in his opening comments yesterday, what we mean by that is that we've discovered that although, technically speaking, the law hasn't changed, we are witnessing an emergence of an institution, a process we call agentification. So what do we mean by that? So, as we stated, there is no significant change in the law. The law governing the director of courts and the administration of courts in Israel has undergone only very technical and minor amendments that do not pertain to the power and competences of this institution. However, if we run an empirical research, as we've done, and the impetus for that empirical research was actually a very sad case. A judge, an Israeli judge, committed suicide. And in his letter accompanying the suicide, he said, workload was too much. Case workload was just too much. I couldn't handle it. And there were issues associated with that. He was summoned for a discussion with the President, Chief Justice. He was summoned for a discussion with the Director of Courts. He was given some chance to keep up with the work. He didn't make it. Now, of course, people do not commit suicide because of workload. I would think. I'm not a mental. I don't know. I don't have the I don't know. I mean, as a matter of professional courtesy to the people wearing white jackets in the other department here. I really don't know anything about mental psychology, but I would assume this is not the only reason. But in any event, this was a sad story, and this told us that we should really look into it. And what we find, I'm going to be really brief in order to keep, I committed myself to Yair to really be on time here. So what do we mean by agentsification? We are suggesting that in fact there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5 variables by which we can measure institutions, and they all deal with capacity. These 5 variables are relevant to the measurement of any assessment of any institution because they measure various angles or various perspectives of capacity. And this capacity really matters if we care not only about de jure law on the books, but if we care about law in action. So to the extent that we are committed to any kind of a realist understanding of the law, even the most stringent formalists, and I consider myself to be a formalist, I worked under Ernie Weinrib, so you cannot but be a formalist to some extent. But even the most stringent formalists must have some idea about the operation of law on the ground. And very interestingly, us public law people, primarily admin law people, we usually cannot care less about the capacity of the institution when we study admin law. We assume that the state is the state. We assume that the state therefore has capacity, and therefore we proceed. We say this is the doctrine, this is what the court said, whether it was actually applied or not. Jeff's point about the 8th inning about state, we don't care about that at all. We don't study that as part of the law, usually. And judges do not take into account the capacity of the institution to uphold their decision, nor do they take into consideration these factors with respect to the duty to develop their capacity in order to uphold the decision or do your job properly. Okay, so what are these 5 factors? And I'm going to be really brief about it. We're talking about organizational capacity. We're talking about a political capacity. This is whether you can carry out your capacity vis-a-vis other institutions, building networks. whether you have legal competences, what powers do you have legally, including the power to interpret your law, Chevron-like powers. Whether you have a structural defensive capacity. What do we mean by that? Whether you can structurally defend yourself against other institutions, and what is your purview of reach? To what extent do you delve into the details and the scope of the issues under your competences? And here we find, I'm going to really go very briefly about that because it's all in the paper. So organizational capacity is whether you can really design your own policies, right? Really solve the problem, plan, administer the programs. This is your organization. Whether you have the wherewithal with which to do it. Philip mentioned that earlier with respect to the judicial management. Can they do it? Well, this is organizational, but do they have the capacity? It includes the size of the organization, the informational self-sustainability. Do you have the information with which to do that? And can you control your internal budget? These are the relevant criteria we found here. The political capacity is whether you can develop your networks, whether you can access, because no single entity can do its job now in the current modern world. You must need assistance of other agencies, normative agents, other legal agencies, and then the question is whether you have this capacity to build those networks. The legal capacity is, of course, your rule-making power. This is and of course the ability to monitor them. The defensive structural capacity is whether you have security of tenure, whether you have security of salary, physical space, whether you have your own physical space. It really is important, and this is why in judicial management issue, whether you have your own building matters in real life. And here is like whether the scope and the reach of the matters, whether you issue very detailed guidelines with respect to who gets which office, who gets which parking lot, who gets sabbatical leave, who gets medical leave, and what type of medical leave. The more deep and wide your outreach is, the more we can talk about emerging capacity. And here is what is important. This you can measure diachronically. So you can measure that time matters. So you can say at a certain point of time we have certain type of agentification. Are we in a process of agentification? De-agentification, because the process can go both ways. And this is our contribution here. This is our data, just to run very quickly. You can see the increase here very briefly. You can see the increase here in terms of self-management. This is the number of people that work under the court administration. And there is a special agreement with the Treasury Department that gives greater power to the court administration. This is the rule-making and policy-making powers. The minister basically told the director of courts in Israel, you deal with it. You can deal with it. That's okay. You devise those things. Information gathering, LegalNet. You don't need any other agency to do that. You can do all the information gathering on your own. The more you have that, the greater your agentification of the capacity is. You have a research unit. We've heard from that. That's important. There's a huge expansion of the purview of reach. The director issues more and more guidelines about more and more things, and network and coalition, what we call the capacity, the political capacity. The director very wisely in Israel started to establish forums where this institution, with that institution, with this secretariat, with that secretariat, bringing them all under his umbrella, so to speak. He is a non-voting member in the judicial appointment and promotion capacity, and moreover, and this is also important, they have their own press unit. So when they communicate with the outer world, they have the administration of justice. They have their own press person to deal with that. So all in all, even though no law has been changed or very minute legal changes, we see the process of agentification. It matters with respect to judicial management because we see those fuzzy lines. They haven't changed the law. What is this thing? Well, it's almost an agency, very close to an agency. The idea of keeping it sometimes fuzzy is on purpose, but it's a de facto agency. But the idea is that these type of criteria may be helpful for the study of other institutions, not just the administration of court. And therefore, it may be relevant for admin law / public policy analysis or interdisciplinary analysis beyond the issue of the most important issue in the world right now, which is, of course, judicial management. It is now 4:13, and I'm done. No, we had the, I'm going. So we now have people who will comment, and I give the floor to Yair to direct us in the discussion, and I will be back, hopefully
with a vengeance.
Yes, with a vengeance.
I need to ask who is coming for dinner so we can order the taxis. Please.
Guess who's coming for dinner?
Not everybody. What's the deal with you guys?
No, we can't make it, I'm sorry.
The video coming? You can,
I'm coming with my car if you need people to ride with the car.
okay.
Can I get a cab or a ride back to the hotel? Thank you.
אני לא רשמתי. Sorry, I need you to... You complicated things with your car thing. You're not coming to them. אוקיי. לא. גם לא התאמנו. Okay, sorry for the interruption. So now we'll hear Ori. Do you have a presentation, Ori?
Nope.
No. You want to sit there? You want to come over? I go. Do you have a mic? This one is not working.
I'll take
זה לא עובד. עוד פעם.
Okay. Thank you for thanks for the invitation. For the whole project, actually. It's both fascinating. It's also significantly important because well, no one has done anything like this before, not in the sense of the methodology necessarily, but about sort of the subject matter. It's really interesting because it's been out there for a long while and has had a lot of impact, as you've shown. So the project is really valuable. Well, both in theory, but also just for us to know what's going on here in the Israeli legal system. So thank you just for the contribution. A few thoughts about this, about the paper, the agentsification paper that Amnon just presented briefly. So the most general kind of reflection from which I'm going to develop a few smaller points is the question of mechanism, right? So mostly what we saw is kind of a narrative of, well, here's how things look at some point, here's a development, a sort of descriptive narrative of development, and here is where we are now. But we still haven't fully deciphered the mechanisms that sort of have brought us to this point. Rather, we know how the processes look, and those most of my questions or comments or thoughts will reflect on the questions of mechanisms. So I'll say one kind of thought about the institutional design and development aspect of the paper, another about judicial independence aspect of the paper, and then a third that will try to somehow combine the two topics. So in terms of institutional design of development, kind of the main narrative of the story, Amnon interestingly stated here even though it was very short, he added one sentence that did not appear in I think the paper, which is this can go back and forth, right? So this we can see agentification, then we can see de-agentification. I was wondering about that, right? Whether the narrative does have some sort of a sort of fatalistic kind of expanding universe sort of aspect to it, some sort of a path dependence kind of narrative of this is what happens to administrative agencies worldwide. We expect administrative agencies that if they have some vacuum to sort of fill that up with budgets, appointments, positions, roles, jobs, decisions, etc. And because this vacuum existed and sort of somewhere between the political and the legal in Israel, then sort of the administration just expanded into that. We sort of expect that to keep happening, right? So one question is this a story of sort of this kind of path-dependent enlargement of administrative power, which, as you stated correctly, I think is sort of is one possible general story of the administrative state, not necessarily only of judiciaries. But obviously, this is an interesting question. So, is there something special here about this expansion narrative in the context of the judiciary, right? So, answer one question: is this just a test case of kind of a path-dependent narrative we kind of know of the administrative state over the course of the 20th century, or did we identify something special here to the legal field? Interestingly, as we saw in the previous panel, Israel is not the only jurisdiction in which these kind of questions are not explicitly regulated in constitutions or in statutes, right? So, how come, right? This, unlike perhaps other administrative powers, which are perhaps more clearly or more explicitly stipulated in regulatory legislation, right? What makes the judiciary kind of exempt of that? So, whether independence came in somehow and sort of created the notion of independence, right? Created some special space that's not the normal space that we see in the expansion of administrative powers in other context. The other question, this goes to Amnon's point that we can see a contraction, right, of this universe is, well, how would that look? And this is a question of mechanism, right? So there's this paper by Una Hathaway, right, about path dependence in the law, and she uses this nice, I think, notion of a puncture, right? So it's not that everything is completely path dependent, that we can never stop processes from going in one direction, but sort of the interesting question for us then, she says, is, well, let's identify the mechanisms that would actually enable us to stop or to divert a path to a different direction. And here's a question just to the former. So what would be the conditions for, I think she uses puncture or punctuation, right, of this process that might actually lead to a contraction, right, of the power of the court administration? And sort of different thoughts can be put forward. Is this mostly a personal aspect, right? That just these guys more or less generally go along over the years? So the main characters in your story, right, are Chief Justice, Minister of Justice, and then the administrator, right, the director. And everyone knew to appoint the right person in that middle role that sort of let them sort of live a happy life together, and therefore kind of the administration kept sort of expanding, right? Could we sort of imagine a point in which suddenly someone is appointed to that job who's no longer willing to show up whenever the Chief Justice calls him, right? Or on the other hand, says, no, I'm now going to, so now we have a big fight between the judiciary and the Ministry of Justice. Is going to say, I'm going to side now with the judiciary completely, right? Say I'm a judge, I'm sort of playing politics, right? Could that be perhaps a condition? So is this more about sort of personal political strategy, perhaps even character? Right, as part of the story, or do we have something structural here that could actually tell us also something about the possibilities of shifting the path, or even sort of completely right, reversing it in terms of contracting the universe of administration? Another way to ask is, at what point will politics care enough, right, to intervene? Or on the other hand, this sort of leads to my next point: at what point would judges care enough to disregard, right, the administration and say, well, okay, you've gone too far, we want our independence back, and therefore, there's no law that compels us to listen to you? Would that be the point of departure from the current path, if there is ever going to be one, right? If we're not completely fatalistic about that. So going to judicial independence, and again, in terms of the mechanism. So we have the example of the judge who committed suicide, and we can find these sort of anecdotal stories that tell us something about the impact that administration has on judges. In that sense, this is the story of judicial independence, or non-dependence, right, as you call it in the paper. But we still don't exactly know, right, what's the mechanism of influence here, or in other words, what's the relationship between this completely persuasive story of expansion, right, agencyfication, and the kinds of incentives, pressures, stresses that work on judges. Is it more kind of an expressive sort of mechanism that there's something about shaming, or you don't want to be the one called to drive up to Jerusalem to meet the Chief Justice and stuff like that, or is it more, or is there some set of actual sanctions that the administration can credibly threaten judges with, and these would go to a sort of more latent set of powers, right? So, for example, oh, you want to teach a course in in Haifa University? Well, be sure to be not too extreme on your sort of statistics of either not too good or not too bad, right? So you don't want to alienate other judges, and you don't want to get anyone mad and stuff like that. So there's some sort of I wonder if we can identify some sort of a kind of a latent mechanism of regulation, right? That it's not, obviously we don't see it in the law because there is no law about anything, but we cannot see it in sort of the kind of evidence that you've developed, right? Which has to do with the organizational arrangement, right? Now we know that methodologically so the administration doesn't let us interview judges, right? So we don't know. You seem to have about these questions. Okay, well, it's difficult, yeah. So that's a challenge. I mean, obviously. No, that's fine. Thank you. That's yeah.
But there's a limited number of and
Not on record. Sorry, go ahead.
You said we don't know exactly how it works, but how this influencing process works. But we have some clear indication that from Israel, your presentation yesterday, that if you organize a competitive element, that judges are very sensitive for it. And from the financing system of the courts in the Netherlands, which is output finance, so production is money.
Right.
But also has led to judges to changing the mindset of judges, going for production, and primarily because the court presidents had asked them to do it. And then what's especially interesting is that this happened 10 years ago, 12 years ago, and the story was like, okay, politics is going to invest into the court system, and we should show that we are responsible and that we can do it. And it was apparently very convincing for the judges. So they started to work very, very hard, resulting in courts could have a financial reserve of 8% of their annual budget. And within half a year, more than half of the courts had more financial reserve than this 8%. The court presidents, the court leadership were not able to spend that money. So at the end of the year, the money flew back to the reserves of the Council for the Judiciary.
And what happened to the incentive then, right? So.
Well, they just continued.
Okay.
They just continued. But the increase in productivity, the increase in production was reached by working at night and in the weekends. And after 2 years, the judges started to comment that they were a little bit tired.
Yeah, exactly, right.
So somehow, I don't know why, but the experience is similar. They are apparently very sensitive for this type of
The presidents are. Yeah.
Well, the presidents, but the
Right.
judges as well.
Yeah, so I mean, unpacking those mechanisms are really fascinating, and obviously, so they have to do with independence. They have to do with production as well, right? The quality of production. Do you want to be the litigant who gets an opinion that was written at 2 in the morning, right, after a full day of adjudication, right? How would that affect? So, these are questions that are very, very sort of difficult to decipher. Just one word. So some of it could be. So one of it could somehow be translated into monetary kind of incentives, right? But that's really difficult. You can't touch. You can't give them more money, right? That's not allowed. That's yeah. In salary or whatever, yeah.
If you produce below average, you cut back in salary, and if you produce above average, you could get something extra. But eventually, the Constitutional Court.
Exactly. So there's no constitutional court in the world that would sort of accept that kind of measure. We know that, and no, we can obviously critique that fact. But I mean, that's a. Okay, sorry.
But
But
we have time
but there's kind of there are social kind of factors, right? You like being the judge who's considered the sort of efficient judge, stuff like that. So you can, in some sense, inculcate those kinds of morals, right, within the community of judges. And again, the measures you described don't really identify this kind of cultural kind of element. Sort of what kinds of messages we try to instill with our judges and clerks, etc. And the issue of shaming, right? So that's kind of the other kind of expressive sanction, not the positive incentive, but the negative one. Well, this is again, obviously you touch on this in the paper. We do see the administration, for example, in Israel, highly protective, as you define it, right? This defensive kind of strategy. For example, not letting out any information about caseloads, and we see kind of the administration going to the Supreme Court and sort of denying, sort of arguing against petitions, against freedom of information petitions to just publish information that exists. It's already been collected, so there's no cost there. The information exists, and we see the Supreme Court kind of siding with the administration and saying, you know, this will affect judicial independence. So when the administration does that, it also sends a message to the judges, you know, I have your back here, right? So to what, in that sense, right, to what extent is it actually exerting influence on the judges for example, in the case of caseload management, right? But there are other aspects of that. So this strategical point of whether I'm protecting judges against the outside world or whether I'm sort of affecting their independence with my sort of incentive matrix is still kind of an open question. A kind of side question on that aspect. I wonder, again, going back to the sort of original point of whether there's something special about the institutional context of judges, whether it matters that the people we are regulating here are judges, and whether it's perhaps more difficult for judges than other officials under regulation or state control to complain, right, or to say petition the courts against the court administrator or something like that, right? So we all have the sense of we're going to fight this inside without kind of opening up any of the disputes. Whether there is kind of a silencing effect on the judges to challenge the kind of regulatory possibilities that the administration has that affect their independence to the extent that it does. We also know the judges are not unionized, at least in Israel. They're not allowed to, right? So they don't have even sort of the group labor protective measures they cannot use. So I wonder whether that's kind of, again, a latent sort of force that sort of grants the administration more powers than what we'd see in other regulatory agencies to which this general analysis could apply. You mentioned this repeatedly. Also, I wonder whether the fact that the director has always been a judge, right? He's one of us in some sense, right? So we're not really going to fight him on the independence, right? He knows us from within. And going back to the point of puncture, right? Obviously, it will be interesting to see what happens if and when the justice minister decides to appoint a non-judge to that position. I can already see sort of newspapers saying, you know, we have a constitutional custom, or whatever, it has to be a judge, and this has been entrenched in our institutions and all that. You cannot do that, right? But that's going to be sort of a classic political move to say I'm going to try to break open some sort of a self-protective kind of class in this case of judges. Putting the two questions together of institutional design development and the issue of judicial independence is trying to divert the light to perhaps spheres that you do not fully develop in that paper. And I wonder whether sort of a full account of these two questions would have to include another 3-year project about the other kind of administrative elements, and you mentioned them in passing several times, about the chief judges in the Israeli courts, and this is a guess, not an argument, but that's something similar in the sense of not exactly agentsification, but some sort of expansion of the institutional clout of chief judges. We could also tell a narrative of that sort about Israeli courts over the years. And if that's the case, then our matrix becomes much more sort of complicated to see what exactly is the function that sort of affects judicial independence. What is the structural relationship between the administration, the chief judges, and the judges under them? There's obviously sort of an ideological story here, right? We know at least in the past few years, part of the enhancement of the power of chief judges in the diverse courts has been for the explicit intention to weaken the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, right? So if we don't want only one Chief Judge to sort of represent the whole system, well, let's just empower some more judges around the country. And we know that this was part of the story, which ties into sort of centralization and diffusion, the question of centralization versus diffusion and their effect on independence, right? So do we go to the Chief Justice of local courts, or do we sort of just talk to the Chief Justice? And the Chief Justice will be sort of the final, obviously, kind of corner of that triangle, right? What exactly happened with that Chief Justice? Again, we don't have, I know, so I clerked for the Chief Justice many years ago, and the first day, his assistant came to, sort of the senior clerk came and told me, well, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to read all of the pieces of legislation that mention the Chief Justice, so you know what we do here, right? And then you start looking up, and you see he really has all these powers to divert cases from one place to the other, and so you have all these little pieces of legislation that give the Chief Justice very kind of technical powers, right? But then we know the Chief Justice sort of defines himself or herself as the head of the judiciary, right, in some sense. And when the Chief Justice doesn't have any official power authority to call up a judge in the magistrate court and tell him or her, come up to Jerusalem, I'd like to meet you face to face. But we know that when this call comes, the judge immediately sort of cancels her docket and drives up to Jerusalem. So where did that dynamic come from? Again, it's kind of a parallel narrative to the agentification one you tell us about the administration. Okay, so.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, is not here, so we turn to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me. Doesn't work anyway. I think I will speak. Everything I say, yeah. Okay, thanks for inviting me. This is a very interesting conference, surprisingly. I'm not an expert in any of these fields specifically, but it's led me to think several thoughts and develop some ideas, and I'm very impressed by your theoretical basis for the exploration of capacity and agentification. So I was thinking, what can I add to this wonderful set of papers? So, I decided I'd print out the statute, just, to do something. And then I was quite amazed to see that this statute has been amended 94 times. No, I spend a lot of, I recycle all my papers and I print them on both sides. Okay. All my papers have found a lot of place in dumps, garbage dumps.
Rewrite it, yeah.
Yeah. And that as well. I was looking at the statute, and I see there are about 96 amendments, which is a huge number for a statute that was enacted in 1984. Of the consolidated version.
That's the court's law.
Yeah, the court's law. So I thought I'd look at the amendments that had anything to do with the court's administrator. Now, Amnon did mention before that there were very few and very limited in scope, but before I start talking about them, I want to clarify that I am not a formalist at all. All my work is about politics and culture and tradition, and not only about black letter law. But obviously law is a very influential institution, and since institutions matter, law is also influenced, its creation is influenced by power struggles, and also, once accepted, it also helps to further certain of those struggles and enhance strengthen one party, etc. So, and actually, there are 3 amendments that grant authority or additional powers to the court administrator. And they were enacted in 2008, 2012, and 2016. Very conveniently, 4 years between each other. And you see a huge difference. So I didn't do any historical study because this is not this is your work. But I looked at the content of the amendment, and also if there was anything illuminating in the explanatory notes of the bills. So I'll just list them, and then there'll be some analysis. The first amendment we should talk about from 2008 is basically the grant of some ancillary powers to the court administrator when a new court is established. So it can be a local court, a lower court, or an appeal court. In this case, in both cases, there's a power to make rules about the transitional period where the old court, the original court, has cases that most of them have not been heard at all, or some of them have already begun. So the main power originally was that the Minister of Justice could set transitory rules and should be advised by the President of the Supreme Court. But in addition, and that's the amendment, the court administrator was given powers to order that certain types of cases that have not been heard at all can be moved to a new court, even they originally were to remain in the original court. So it's only ancillary, and it's very limited, and the power that it all relies on the rules that the Ministry of Justice made. I looked at the explanatory notes. They're not very helpful, usually. There's nothing there except a repetition of the content of the provision. Okay, now if I move to 2012, again we're talking about moving cases from one court to another, but here we see that the court administrator is authorized to move certain civil and traffic cases filed in one court and not yet begun hearing, the same kind of situation, to another court on the same level. And this is to balance the division of, the labor of the courts. Now, this can only happen if the court administrator is authorized by the Supreme Court President, but the statute doesn't mention if a general authorization can be granted or if for each moval from one court to another you need an authorization. So just to enhance my case, I'll argue that the Supreme Court President can basically authorize a sort of a semi-blanket authorization to the court administrator. And what I find in the explanatory notes, kind of unique, is an explanation why, and it goes like this. Due to the development of the computerized system, Net HaMishpat, I suppose we talked about this yesterday, in its installation in the courts, two-time statistical analysis are available, and therefore, and following the recommendation of the Ronen Committee, which was a committee appointed by the court administrator, with members from the judiciary, from the Ministry of Finance, and from the Ministry of Justice, following their recommendation, and to promote efficiency. That was the mandate given to this commission. This is why the amendment was introduced, actually giving the court administrator some power to move cases from court to court. Right. Now I move to the third amendment, just recently passed in June. This is a new chapter. It's involved with the creation of the court's guard, a special guard that is now, like in the Knesset, there's a special guard. They are distinct from the military or distinct from the police. So now there has been established a court's guard. And what's interesting to see here, that the court administrator receives the power to appoint the head of the court's guard. Yes, he needs to get the consent of the Supreme Court, President, and the Ministry of Justice, but it's his power, or her power. Again, nothing to be said in the explanatory notes except a repetition. Now, look, I look at these amendments not as whether they are power enhancing or not necessarily, but I see some kind of a process. Happily, I have three cases, so you know you can draw a straight line when you have 3 dots. So my case has been proven, of course. But what I see here is that these amendments also represent the status quo at the moment of the legislation, and can also be viewed on a time scale. Let's assume that the initial grants of power to the court's administration, as we saw in the historical paper, was based on a variety of reasons, inter alia not to give the Ministry of Justice all the powers, and definitely not to give the Supreme Court, the judiciary, all the powers of regulation and administration. So we can explain the minimal role of the administrator, really as administrator with very little discretion involved. Now we see some kind of a change in 2008, where there is more discretion that the court administrator has, and definitely in 2012, it seems like it is almost obvious that the person who should appoint the head of the court guard should be the court's administrator himself or herself. One can explain all of this. It is anecdotal, I agree. One can explain all of this to show a sort of an interaction process where once some power is given to the court administrator, it strengthens the court administration, and therefore when a new amendment is advanced, the power struggle is different already. So you give them more, and hereby you also enhance them further. And by 2016, we have a completely different situation when we compare it to 2008 and obviously earlier. So this sort of corroborates your general argument, and I think it might be useful, if you find this at all of interest, to try and trace the politics of these amendments, obviously outside of the explanatory notes. I didn't do any more than that. And to see whether this supports some of your discussions in another element, in another aspect. So thanks again for inviting me here. So we can have a recess if we have. We also have one less. Ranan is not coming?
No, Ranan is here.
Where?
We just had a recess.
Ranan is here. He sat there.
I know, but you have to leave.
Oh,
Unexpectedly.
Oh,
so he's not there?
so we can have a break.
You know what, so let's say
Okay.